Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the part of the world that you are joining us from. I'm Scott. I'm joined by my colleague Pontus. We're going to wait about 90 seconds or so just to let people get into the Zoom room before we start today's webinar, Beating Disruption, a new model for jumpstarting transformation. And don't worry if you miss a minute or two of this, this will be recorded so you can listen to it later, share it with colleagues, and so on. So I see that number of participants is still going up. So once it steadies out, we'll get started, but plan to wait about 60 seconds or so before we get into the conversation. And those of you just joining, you have Scott and Pontus here, both from Innosight, getting ready to host today's webinar, Beating Disruption, a new model for jumpstarting transformation. We're going to wait now 30 seconds and get started. Of course, whenever you say that, Pontus, I thought the number had stopped and then a few more people come in, and you never know the exact right moment to get these things going.
It's still picking up.
All right, we will get started in just a few seconds because this is being recorded. So those who wander in a couple minutes late can always go and hear the exciting repartee at the beginning if they want to rewind and hear all of that. So just want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we're going to jump into today's discussion. Now, those of you who know Innosight know that our purpose is to empower forward-thinking organizations to navigate disruptive change and own the future. And in this webinar, we are going to talk about how you can do exactly that, how you can jumpstart transformation to ultimately beat disruption. The way we're going to do this is we're going to do it in three parts. Part one is going to be a focus on the problem we're trying to solve. What is the challenge that we're addressing? Part two will be our answer. And then in part three, Pontus and I will offer a few summary reflections. I'm going to be the overall MC for the discussion, but Pontus and I have a pretty equal distribution, I think, of the content that we will be sharing as we go through this. So just a couple of points of housekeeping before we get into the material. This webinar is indeed being recorded, so if you miss a couple minutes, no problem. You want to share it with colleagues, that's great. You'll get a link and the presentation slides after the webinar. We have muted all of your lines. The only voices you will hear will be me and Pontus. You've got the usual Zoom features, which I assume everyone is well acclimated to by now. If you're not usually on the Zoom platform, if you click the Q&A tab, you can type in a question. Pontus and I plan to stop 2 times for questions. We'll see exactly how the discussion goes, of course. We do have a few poll questions that we're going to ask to get some of your perspectives on topics. When we ask the poll question, make sure you click the submit button so that your voice is heard. And I see a couple of you have already gone into the chat window. It's great for you to use it. We'll be looking at it loosely. So if we don't respond to something in there, that don't feel like we're ignoring you. But I see a couple people have said where they're from. And we've got visitors from Colombia and Brazil that are represented. I'm joining from the great city of Boston, Massachusetts. Pontus, where are you joining from today?
I'm just outside Geneva in Switzerland.
Fantastic. So we've got a quite international gathering here already. Okay, so with all of that, I think that's enough throat clearing and we can get right into the material at hand. So part one, the problem. The way that we frame up the problem that we dive into in our somewhat ominously titled Harvard Business Review article, Persuade Your Company to Change Before It's Too Late, is what we call the information action paradox. So let's explain to you a little bit about what exactly that means. We're going to start by winding back the clock about 15 years ago and talk about a big disruptive change in the mobile phone industry. It started, of course, in 2007 when Apple enters the industry with the iPhone platform and the Android operating system is introduced. Ultimately, what ends up happening is a complete transformation and reorganization of that industry. These are a couple leaders in that industry who had some pretty interesting quotes that gave their view of what was going on in the industry. On the left side of the page, you have Jim Balsillie, the co-CEO of Research in Motion, ultimately renamed BlackBerry. He went on a Canadian chat show in early April 2008, almost a year after the iPhone entered the market, and said this: "I don't look up too much or down too much. The great fun is doing what you do every day. I'm sort of a poster child for not doing anything but what we do every day. Not worried about the iPhone. We're sort of a very poorly diversified portfolio. It either goes to the moon or it crashes to Earth. But it's going to the moon pretty well, so I'm not worried about it." Well, fast forward the movie a couple years later, and things are beginning to look a little bit different. The smugness you see there, the dismissiveness you read there, has turned into a different sentiment. The person on the right side of the page is Stephen Elop. In 2010, a couple years after this quote from Jim Balsillie, he became the first non-Finnish CEO of Nokia. In February of 2011, he wrote what became known as the Burning Platform Memo. This is the way he described Nokia's situation. We are standing on a burning platform, and we have more than one explosion. We have multiple points of scorching heat that are fueling a blazing fire around us. Now, Pontus, while you live in Switzerland, I know that you hail from Finland, and we know how the story ends for both of these organizations. Nokia sells its handset business off to Microsoft. What is your reaction as a Finnish person representing your entire country to what happened to Nokia?
Well, it's indeed an interesting but painful part of Finnish corporate history. But I think there are interesting lessons to be learned from that. I reread the memo, and it is quite dramatic. And Elop was criticized quite widely for writing it. But it's useful to remember that in February 2011, Nokia still had 30% of the global mobile phone market. So you can be on a burning platform with a 30% global market share of a very lucrative business, in this case, the mobile phones. So I think that's an interesting insight that they were quite successful still commercially, but the writing was on the wall on how the business was going to change. And you could argue that many businesses are on a burning platform, but the Nokia platform was burning faster than many other businesses due to its technological, the nature of the business and the technology that was changing so quickly. I guess it's also interesting to speculate when was it too late for Nokia to significantly change course and strategy and operating model. And I would argue certainly before 2011, maybe the right date would be somewhere in 2007 when, as you mentioned, the iPhone was launched. But that was also the year when the then CEO, Kallisvuor, appeared on Forbes, and the title was, "Can anyone catch the mobile phone king?" And the answer is indeed they can. One final point is that it's more important to understand the dynamics of change than the specific schedule of change. And I think by 2011, even though the Nokia business was quite robust, people, and Elop certainly understood the dynamics of change and how the industry was changing, even though the timetable of demise was unclear. So I think the lesson is you can still be very successful. You can end up on a burning platform. Technology businesses maybe burn faster than other businesses, and you have to understand the dynamics of change.
You know, it's interesting, Pontus, you referenced that 2007 very famous Forbes cover story. You know, if you look at what happened here, this is not a problem of myopia. It wasn't that people didn't see that there was change happening in the industry. And indeed, this is a common pattern that we see. People often think it's that the leaders are blinded by the big change in their industry. And that's never the case. I call this the gallery of missed opportunities, where Nokia had a touchscreen phone well before Apple entered the marketplace. You know, as I think of the world right now, I think of the financial services industry, and I wonder, you know, as you have decentralized finance, so-called Web 3.0, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin-based things, et cetera, robo-advisors, is that the next thing we're going to see? All the banks in the world see it coming at them just plain as day, but will they be able to ultimately respond? That's the question I think we all have to ask. And I wonder, where else do you see this happening? Where do you see somebody who might be Jim Balsillie circa 2008?
I think all industries that are predicated on data refinement, you know, professional services, law that we'll talk about later, banking, certainly financial services, as you mentioned. I think the digital disruption is becoming an increasingly serious threat in those businesses. So I look at everything from professional services I mentioned, even things like recruiting, consulting, law, banking, which are all predicated on the refinement and kind of development of data-based assets. I think all of them are a threat. Of course, education, I would argue, is certainly in that space, which is a pure information business. So I guess the short version is that pure information businesses that previously had deep moats around them, I think are increasingly under threat.
And we'll talk a little bit more in the second act about what the audience's perspective is about industry change after we do a little bit more about the nature of the problem and give you some of the ways to frame it up. So education will be one that we might have a chance to talk about a little bit more. But the data suggests that this is a pretty wide, pretty persistent problem. Those of you, again, who follow Innosight know that we've been doing this longitudinal research of company lifespan on the S&P 500 index, and it has generally been trending down to the point where the analysis suggests that half of the S&P 500 will turn over in the course of the next decade. So that's a huge amount of change in a pretty short period of time. And we've done some additional research that says the biggest thing that is standing in the way of the 72% of people who say they need to fundamentally transform is shifting resources to drive change, which means leaders don't have the conviction to take action. So let's get your voice into the discussion here. So I'm going to open up a poll question here, a couple poll questions actually, about the pace of change in your industry. So this is going to be launched on your Zoom screen here, where you've got 2 questions here. The first question is, my organization is changing as fast or faster than our industry. So to what degree do you agree with this statement? You could either highly disagree all the way up to highly agree. And then the second question, assuming that you've got some challenges here, what stops you from responding faster? So we have 4 choices that you can pick, and you can pick as many of them as you'd like. It could be that we're not aligned about what to do. We're not aligned about the fundamental need to do something. We lack key capabilities, or we are too busy running the engine. And I'm going to wait just about a minute. I see there are responses coming up here, but going to wait just about a minute before I make this live. While we wait here, just a reminder, we're a few minutes away from pausing for the first time to get questions. At any point, if you've got a question that you want to lodge, go and click the Q&A button that's on your Zoom toolbar and go and type your question in. We would love to answer as many questions as you have. I see the number is still going up here, so I'm going to wait just 15 more seconds, and then I'm going to close the poll. Of course, once I said that, then, okay, 1 more came in. So I will end the poll, and I will share the results. So Pontus, I'm going to ask you to comment on this. So the first question, it looks like we've got answers in every category, but we've got an interesting little distribution. What do you make of this? 28 of 74 disagreed, 23 of 74 agreed. So it looks like the Golden Gate Bridge, I guess, turned to the side.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess usually what we see is that it's the exception that organizations are changing faster than the industry, and there certainly are those organizations, but I would say they are almost by definition the exception, because the big bulk of any industry, the mass of the companies, usually they change slowly, and then you've got the leaders who differentiate themselves, and then of course others play catch up. So it's an interesting mix. I'm surprised a little bit that there's so many people who agree or highly agree, but I think that's great. There are, of course, forward-thinking companies who are changing, who understand the dynamics of change, and that's wonderful to see participants from organizations like that. But interesting also that there is I guess almost 50% who disagree, which would indicate that they're changing slower than the industry. So an interesting mix of perspectives, not very clear cut, I would say. What are your thoughts, Scott?
Yeah, same thing. I think our general field experience, and of course it's biased because the people who generally seek us out are people who've got problems, but our field experience suggests that very few people actually really feel like they're outpacing their industry. And even those that are, in some cases say, I'm going faster than my industry, but my industry as a whole is going way too slow. So financial services, as an example, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed person is king. So, you might be moving really fast in financial services, but is that fast enough, given everything that's going on? I think something to think about. Then I guess if we look at the second question, Pontus, so we have just about every answer represented, but we are too busy running the engine received the most votes. Are you surprised by that, or is that what you would have expected to see?
No surprise there. I think this is more intuitive. I think it is the tyranny of the present which often stops organizations from wrestling with these questions. And I think people are just so busy with day-to-day and of course the issues that arise, that the pandemic and others that have of course added additional pressures to the leadership agenda. I think it's interesting to think back at how many times have I had meetings that deal with this question scheduled on Friday afternoon with people who mean very well and actually want to deal with them, but that is often the only time they can find. And I really take it as almost a marker of how often are meetings in a given organization scheduled on Friday afternoon as the only time slot that leaders have to wrestle with these substantive questions. So I think this is really one of the key challenges companies face.
It's a great point. It reminds me of somebody who helped drive the consumer centricity movement in Procter & Gamble a couple decades ago, Anne Lilycone. And one of the things that she said was just an imperative as they did that was Monday AM, not Friday PM. That is absolutely right. If it's Friday PM, it's easy to cancel. You're mentally fatigued. It says everything that it needs to say about how seriously you're taking the problem. All right, let's do one more slide before we break for the first time for questions. I see there are a couple in the Q&A, and I saw there was one in chat as well, so that's great. We've got good seating to discuss. But let's talk a little bit about the basic frame that we have around this challenge. So Pontus, you want to explain this little chart that we have on the left side of the page?
Sure. So this is the stylized representation of the information action paradox. And basically it says that as publicly available data increases, your freedom to operate decreases over time. And this applies to all kinds of disciplines, not only innovation and business creation, but also investing, political science, military affairs, and all the rest of it. It's kind of a basic, it's a fundamental kind of paradox, I guess, that leaders and others have to wrestle with. And in some ways, leaders, when they set strategy, especially in disruptive times, they have to consider these three things. They have to think about their freedom to operate. They have to think about the information on which they make choices. And of course, the time it takes to do that. And leaders not only have to decide what to do, they also have to convince others in the organization to do that. So there's a dual challenge also in that. They have to formulate the strategy, and then they have to convince their leadership team and the broader organization to pursue it. And as they're doing that, those two things, they're wrestling with the information action paradox. And that's a real challenge. And in some ways, both of these things are very valuable. We all value good data. And of course, we value the freedom to operate and to do what we want, but there's a tension between them. And I would say that as a final comment, that this is the real challenge of leadership. If you have perfect data, it's easy to know what to do, and it's easy to convince others. You just show them the perfect data, and it's kind of obvious. The challenge is that leaders have to make decisions with imperfect data. And I think that's the fundamental challenge of leadership. How do you make consequential decisions with imperfect data? And that's what the information action paradox schematic here tries to capture.
Great. Well, I'll just add a couple things to this, and then we'll get some great questions from the audience. So you heard Pontus talk a lot about how you have to do two things. You have to have the information, you have to have conviction too, and then you've got to build alignment that you're going to go and do that. And that's where this gets even trickier, because in the article we do a kind of a thought experiment. Contrast two different people making a decision. So you might have an entrepreneur who's got a threshold of proof that is all the way on the left side of this chart. Because they're an entrepreneur, they don't have to convince a whole bunch of people. They might trust their intuition and judgment. And then on the right side, you might have somebody inside a large organization that does have to get a number of people aligned to act. And the fundamental challenge you then have is by the time the data are clear, there's not anything that you can do about it. So you get into a situation like that, and you wait till you're on the right side of the information action paradox, and boom, you find yourself on that proverbial burning platform where it's too late to make any change. And we make heroes out of the people who take bold actions on burning platforms, but there's no heroism when you do something because you are forced to do it. Now, why does this all exist? It's the basic problem that we talk about in the article, is that decisions are made by human beings, and human beings have all sorts of biases and blind spots that make it really hard for them to make good decisions through uncertainty. And they compound when you're inside a large organization. Loss aversion is one of the most famous ones. As humans, we get more utility from avoiding losses than receiving gains. When we're entrepreneurs, we don't have much to lose. When we're in big organizations, we have everything to lose. You have great things like the bystander effect, otherwise known as social loafing. You don't want to be the person who points something out in a meeting, because that means you're going to be given work to do. So you just sit there quietly, assuming that someone else is going to notice that your business is in a whole heck of a lot of trouble. And you have one of my personal favorite ones, the illusion of certainty, or the illusion of control. This belief that if we can analyze and measure things, it's a sign that we can actually wrap our arms around things. And as Pontus said, by the time the data are clear, it's too late to do anything about it. You can even make the case that the fact that we over-index in the business world on analysis and technical skills is a little bit of a defense mechanism, that we can't control the world, but we really wish that we could. This is the information action paradox. This is the reason why we think it is so hard for people to make good decisions as they face disruptive change. All right, so with that, we're at the kind of first breaking point of our discussion, where we want to get a few questions. So let me take these slides down so you can see our faces maybe a little bit bigger. Whether that's a feature or a flaw is completely up to you, but I'm going to take the slides down. Pontus, we've gotten a few questions that have come in, so I'm going to pick a couple of these to answer, and we're not going to get to every of these now, just in the interest of time, but we'll do a couple of these, and then we'll get into the second part, which is our answer to the information action paradox. All right, so here's a great question from Hub2. So thank you for your question, Hub2, and thank you for putting your name against it too. Are fast-changing organizations, faster than the industry, necessarily good? Our organization changes so fast and so frequently to the point that we cannot measure our impact, and often we repeat what was done 10 or 20 years ago. Hub2 works for a not-for-profit. So is there such a thing, Pontus, as too much change? How do you think about striking that balance?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I think there's only so much change an organization, and probably also individuals, can absorb. So I think one has to be cautious with driving change, and one certainly shouldn't change just for the sake of change. So I do think there's such a thing as too much. You have to determine how much do we think the organization can tolerate, and with what type of timeline. But of course, that has to be juxtaposed then, or taken into consideration the question of how fast is the external operating environment changing, and so on. And arguably, using the Nokia example, there are situations in a company's history when you do have to change quite significantly. But I think the point is well taken. It has to be very measured, and it has to be well motivated, because if people understand why they're changing, that change becomes a lot easier. And again, there we come into this question of what kind of data can we create to convince the organization, to motivate the organization to change.
You know, Pontus, so my reflection on this question, which I think indeed is a great one, there's a line from the philosopher George Santayana, who said, a fanatic is one who redoubles their speed when they've lost their direction. And, you know, what I see when you have this problem of too much change, I think of a large, very well-known organization that's going through some struggles now, where the behind-the-scenes story I heard is they have their third reorganization done by a big strategy consulting company, not us, in the last 5 years. It's like, okay, well, you don't really know what you're doing. So in the absence of having any idea what to do, let's reorg again. And that just blows the organization up. They should be doing some bold things to set a strategic direction and move in new spaces. But in absence of knowing what to do, they're just like, well, let's go from M-form to matrix to agile to whatever. And they've redoubled their speed because, in my view, they've lost their direction. So there definitely can be too much change. Well, we had another question here in the chat, Pontus, that I wanted to put on the table from Benjamin Fisher. Is the struggle to respond, by and large, a function of imagination, not knowing what to do, or operations, not knowing how to do it? What's your view on that?
It's another good question. My take is that it's easier not to wrestle with the question. It's easier to operate under the current model, and many leaders are in their positions for a limited amount of time, and don't want to wrestle, and for good reasons. I mean, I sympathize that often it's very difficult, but I think it's the inability and unwillingness to dedicate time and effort to wrestle with the question that's the primary cause. It's not that the change in the industry is a secret, or what's happening is a secret, and so on. I think it's the inability or unwillingness to dedicate enough time and resource to build the data, to wrestle with the implications of the data, and then to put a program to implement. But it's always, I think, quite well known how an industry is changing, and we can debate the timelines; those are difficult to predict. But the direction and trajectory of change, I think, is often quite predictable.
Great. Well, I'm going to take one more question now, and then we'll get to the second discussion. I'm going to call on the question from Murthy. I think Murthy's question is a great one. Innovators at the beginning of freedom has an advantage, however, that has too much far-range choice. Slightly later, when some data is available from the first mover, then the direction for the follower could be somewhat clearer. Is it not a big dilemma? And let me just offer one thought before, Pontus, we hear your thoughts. I just read the book Invent and Wander, which essentially is all of Jeff Bezos's letters to shareholders from Amazon. And there's actually two parts to this answer if you read through those letters. One is separating out the type of decisions you make. Some of those decisions are reversible decisions. They're easy things to do, and you do those quickly. You trust people's judgment, you go and do it. Some of those are irreversible. It's a one-way door. You go and make a big acquisition. You go and do something that is going to be a multi-year fight with regulators. Those things you make in very carefully, slow, considered ways with multiple viewpoints on it. So that's point one. You recognize the type of decision you're making. Point two, the general guidance Bezos says is, in their experience, you have to get to about 70% certainty, which is not dissimilar to what the military will advise. 50%, you're flipping a coin. 100%, the war's over. So those would be two things that I would say. And Pontus, now give you the last word before we get to the second act.
Yeah, briefly, I think obviously we need data. You shouldn't be gambling with no data or very little data. And the other thing is, I would say, is that organizations also have a limited amount of patience for results. So if you're very early, if you're very visionary, like the Nescafé capsules, first patented in the 70s, scaled in 2000, very few organizations have the patience to wait that long. So there is a real, I think, struggle to determine where we are in terms of the dynamics of change and when we should start investing more seriously in a given industry or technology. So it's not an easy one, but I think again, you need substantial data, I think, to commit substantial resources.
Awesome. Well, there's a couple more great questions, including one, Pontus, that I know is very near and dear to your heart about using jobs to be done as a North Star for transformation that I hope we will get a few minutes to answer as we get into the second part of the discussion. But you can't pose a problem without giving an answer. So what we're going to do now is give the answer that we propose for how you overcome the information action paradox. And as before, Pontus and I will do some back and forth as we go through this. So this comes out of our article, Persuade Your Company to Change Before It's Too Late, written by Pontus, myself, and our colleague Utsav, who is based in our Singapore office. And the answer that we offer is pretty straightforward. So if the problem is the public data lags, go and generate private data. And Pontus will tell you a little bit more about what private data looks like. If it's hard to make sense of what's going on in the data, have models and frameworks that help you sense and interpret weak signals. We're particularly fond, of course, being founded by Clayton Christensen, of the disruptive innovation model. And we'll talk a little bit about the way in which we use it. And then to one of the questions that came in the Q&A, Jim's question about how do you really know that you're aligned or not, hold what we call strategic dialogues to surface and address areas of misalignment and ultimately build the collective conviction around the need for early action. So we will go through all of this and we will put it in context. So I will give the mic over to you, Pontus, to talk about the context and then talk about private data.
Yeah, so just to set the scene a little bit, the company that appears in the HBR article and which we worked with is called King Wood Mallesons. It's the premier law firm in Australia, serving many of the blue chip companies in that country and across the region. And we started the collaboration in 2018, as the article details. And again, this was a very successful and is a very successful company, a leader in its industry and in its market. And again, there was no immediate reason to change or even to wrestle with these questions. But of course, in this case, there were individuals and leaders in the company who saw the industry changing, as have many others in the industry. So the industry change is not unique as such, and many have written about it and observed it. And the challenge, of course, is that lawyers are, as the quote here suggests, risk averse. That's part of the industry and the job they do. They want good information. They always look for the risks in a contract or in a negotiation or what have you. But in this situation, the information was not perfect. And again, no one knows exactly how quickly the legal industry will change. No one knows exactly what happens to different types of companies within the industry. No one knows exactly how quickly customers will change their purchasing habits and so on. But this organization, KWM, was willing to wrestle with these questions and to consider them very seriously and to think about possible implications and strategies and so on. And one of the key aspects of that exercise was what we call in the article, the generation of private data. And I guess I would just point out that private data is not secret data. It's not that it was a secret. And actually, much of the private data was in the heads of individual practitioners and partners at KWM. And of course, we, as consultants, you might imagine, we talk to a lot of people, including the clients of the clients and people inside the organization, and did the usual analysis that one might imagine. And what you find when you do that exercise is that actually many people who are close to the customers and close to the market, they are seeing what's happening, but they don't really have a common language. They look at it from different perspectives, from different practices and so on. So they don't have a common language or a common narrative of what's happening, and they don't combine it with financial analysis, and they don't look at it from the same kind of perspective as we might, since this is what we do and have done for decades. And basically, the private data is as much about gathering the data, but it's also creating the narrative and putting it in context. And I think putting the data in context is probably more valuable than finding an extra piece of data of what a customer says about industry change and so on, because again, those data points, it depends a lot on the industry that the law firm itself is serving. So I think with private data, the key point is you have to gather it from multiple sources. Much of it already exists in people's heads. They know it, but they articulate it differently. So you kind of have to standardize the language, and you have to put it in the context of the dynamics of change. And when we did that, quite a clear picture emerged, which again is not a secret, which is that the legal industry is changing, and we cannot predict the time exactly, but we can predict that in 10 years, we can say with a degree of confidence, that the legal industry and law will be practiced differently, substantially differently than it is practiced today. And I think that was probably the most valuable part of gathering what's called private data. But again, anyone in the legal space or in financial services or any industry, this data can be gathered and standardized, and a narrative can be created. And I think that's probably the point to take away on private data.
And I'll just then build on that point about the narrative being created as we transition to the second thing, which is using models and frameworks to sense make as you begin to get this private data. Because ultimately, one challenge you have is the data are all there. You've gone and gathered, you've looked at it from multiple ways, but what does it actually mean? Does it mean little change, big change? And of course, one of the tools we come back to frequently, as mentioned before, is the idea of disruptive change. So the table here is a slightly modified version of something that appeared in our book, Dual Transformation, which came out in 2017, with just a pretty simple set of almost gut check level questions or areas to look at to determine, is this something that could have disruptive impact on a market, could ultimately transform the economics of the market, the leaders in the market, and so on. I'm not going to read everything that's on the table, but I do want to point out a couple of things that really highlight some of the things you see that indicate disruption is afoot. And then I'd like, Pontus, you to comment on what we saw as the most pertinent signs of particular disruption or potential disruption for KWM. So let me point out three of the rows here. So first, the industry entrant activity. Those of you who have studied Clayton Christensen's work know that classically, not always, but classically, disruption tends to start not squarely in the mainstream of the market, but tends to start at the market fringes, in the lesser demanding customers or the people who historically could not afford or utilize existing solutions. So whenever we see that thing at the fringe, it's just a telltale sign that change could be coming. Then if you look at the business model innovation line, this is a big deal as well. If you ask Christensen a regret about some of his early work, it's that he called it disruptive technology. when in reality, the disruption is not the technology. Anyone can copy a technology. It is the business model in which the technology is encased, the way in which you create, capture, or deliver value. You can have three different forms of disruptive business models. You can have something where you go right after an incumbent's big profit driver, like Netflix did when it introduced a subscription model that obviated the late fees that you would pay if you rented movies from Blockbuster. Number two, you can find a way to profit at sustainably lower price points. So this is the classic story of the steel mini mills or the discount airlines. The third thing that you can do is you can re-architect the value network, the way in which you're reaching customers, the way in which you're serving customers. Now, Pontus and I have had very long debates about Tesla, and I don't mean to distract too much with it, but one thing you observe about Tesla is it has a very different way of going to market than other people in the automobile industry, and a very different mindset where you do upgrades, not through hardware, but through software. That's really the thing you need to focus on, in my view, rather than the battery technology. That's kind of a smokescreen. It's the new value network that's more interesting. Then finally, the profit margins. This is a little bit of a paradox of disruption. When you're getting disrupted in the early days, it can feel pretty good because those lesser demanding customers are being picked off. People are competing at lower prices. So you go and get out of those tiers of the market. Your revenue growth starts to slow, but you know what to do. You go and manage your cost, your margins are going up, everything feels good until it doesn't. So when we see the focus of how you drive profit margins shifting from growth to cost management, it's a sign that disruption is really coming, and it may even be too late. So Pontus, I'm curious, just as we go back to King Wood Mallesons, what do you think were most pertinent in KWM's context of the factors we see here?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because KWM, as I said, was when we started and is a very successful organization. So actually, we were looking at a lot of weak signals, and there was nothing obvious. And without going into too much detail, I think one thing we did do is we looked at the most sophisticated customers and talked to some of them, and then we looked at call them the least interesting customers, perhaps, if one wants to say it politely. And I think that's where you see the change, because some customers are more cost sensitive and some customers are very sophisticated, especially the ones that are technologically oriented. And I think looking and talking to the customers in those groups gave us certain indications about how the industry is changing at the bottom of the business, so to say, and at the very, not at the top necessarily from a size perspective, but from a sophistication perspective. And as we pointed out, disruptive entrants and challengers often attack from below, and then incumbents retreat. And that's why we also looked at history. We looked at what has happened over time, what types of work have fallen out perhaps, and how has the mix changed. And so those indications enabled us, I think, to create a narrative about what's happening. But I would highlight that in many of these parameters, there were no apparent warning signs. It looked very good.
Very interesting point that we'll pick back up in just a couple minutes. So I want to do a quick poll here just to get the audience's perspective on this topic. So we've given you a view of the early warning signs of disruptive change. The question is, as you think and reflect on these early warning signs, where do you see signs of imminent disruption? Imminent, we're calling it over the next 5 to 7 years. So we have a bunch of sectors that you can choose between. Which of this sector do you think will change the most over the next 5 to 7 years? And again, make sure you click the submit button so that your voice is heard. And I'm going to wait about 60 seconds for this one, Pontus, and then we will share the results and see what our group has to say. I see a number of other questions have come in too. We will have a second chance where we break to get a few questions in. Our aspiration is to finish before the full hour and give you a few minutes of time back, because no one in the world has ever turned down ever getting time back. So if we don't get to your question in the interest of time, we will seek to answer as many as we can asynchronously and share it with you as part of the feedback from the webinar. And those of you out in Asia who are joining at very silly times of the day, we're going to be doing another session next week. It's going to be me and Michelle Mahoney from King Wood Mallesons. So you're going to hear a different second voice in the discussion. You've had the great consulting voice of Pontus. We'll get the practitioner voice of Michelle next week. And we hope that you can join next week as well, because, you know, same basic content, but it'll be different because a different person. All right, well, we've got more than 80 responses here, Pontus, which means we have not put people to sleep as we've been going through the webinar, which 2 thumbs up for us. I am going to make those responses live. Let's end the poll and share the results. And as we predicted in our pregame show, healthcare is the number one thing here. As I know you've done a fair amount of advisory work in healthcare. What do you think? Do you think we're going to see some changes in healthcare in the years ahead?
Yeah, I think we will, and this poll makes sense to me, maybe with the exception of professional services. But on healthcare, I would say that it's interesting because I've seen in the recent months situations where very sophisticated pharma companies say that when they launch new products, they might have 20 to 30 competitors within a handful of years, whereas historically they might have 1 or 2 for the first 10. So that the competitive intensiveness in very sophisticated, pharmaceutical products is increasing just dramatically, and the exclusivities are much shorter. The competition is much tougher, and I would say that stakeholders, patients, healthcare professionals, and others increasingly expect pharmaceutical companies and others to do much more than just develop innovative drugs. There's a lot around how do you serve, how do you support, how do you educate, how do you get people to actually just fulfill their prescriptions sometimes, and things like that. So healthcare changing a lot, and again, how do you leverage digital to both gather data and amplify the effect of the medications themselves. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and you can almost see it in real time in the world around us.
Yeah, it was interesting to me to see that the industry that got the fewest votes is the food and beverage sector. So, and there's connection between the two because, increasingly one of the things that people are looking for is to have functional foods. And that's been something the industry has talked about for decades, but it's now becoming a reality. So you have the classic blurring of lines between food and beverage and healthcare. You also have new technologies, alternative proteins, and so on that are driving big change. You've got digital disintermediation. I mean, you're still going to drink a liquid and all that. The metaverse is not going to have virtual drinks that fulfill you, but the way in which people are accessing things is changing in a serious way. So even though healthcare, pharmaceutical products, and cans of sparkling water are very different spaces, the underlying forces at work are the forces at work. There is change happening just about everywhere. So let's get to the last part of the model, and then we'll talk about the impact at KWM and then get a couple of questions. This idea of strategic dialogues is a key linchpin of really being able to transcend the information action paradox. The idea here is you're never going to have perfect data, so you create space where you're data informed. You embrace what Linda Hill at the Harvard Business School calls creative abrasion, where you actually get people to state different perspectives with the viewpoint that you want those misalignments to rise to the surface. And you want to have pretty fierce battles, not of individual beliefs, because you never win those, but the different assumptions that you're making about the future. And as you seek to do this, you're very thoughtful about the way you organize these discussions, and you get into and out of the space in a way where people are conditioned Monday morning, not Friday afternoon, to have a real robust dialogue about the future. And you've got a way to tie a bow around what you've talked about, so you're advancing, not retreating in the discussions. Now, Pontus, these strategic dialogues were a big part of the KWM story. You want to tell us a couple moments that really helped to advance the way KWM was thinking about things, and then tell us the happy ending to the KWM story.
Yeah, I guess one point to make is that KWM and the leadership took the time to discuss and disagree where it was needed over a period of time. So this doesn't happen in 2 weeks. I think people need time to process, to develop their perspectives, to revisit the topics, and then to discuss them. And as you said, we had several or many sessions over a period of time where this happened. And one of the sessions that kind of comes to my mind is where we discussed the information action paradox and the question of what is the cost of inaction, and the fact that inaction has a cost. It's very difficult to quantify the cost of inaction, but it has a cost. And when leaders in any industry, but when leaders start to wrestle with that question, I think it becomes a very interesting discussion. And I think the other thing was in that same meeting, we highlighted that the exact time frame doesn't really matter. Is it 5.5 years or 7 years is immaterial for an organization that's over 100 years old. And the question was then that we're not trying to predict the exact future, but we're trying to paint the trajectory and where it's going. And then when you layer that on with the question of what's the cost of inaction, then leaders can actually start making real choices of inaction has a cost, action has a cost. But otherwise, people just look at the action has a cost, and then doing nothing typically is viewed as not having a cost. And that's false. And I think that's what the information action paradox captures well. And we actually use that tool in many of the discussions, as we describe in the article, that there's a question of where are we here? How fast is the industry changing? And finally, I'd say that reasonable people can disagree about these things, and certainly did disagree. But actually, once you have a preponderance of evidence and you have a narrative, and then you get new data constantly, it can become very compelling.
Fantastic. Well, Pontus, I'm just going to pick out just one comment about Shrikant in the chat, and then let's hear the end of the KWM story. Be informed, not driven by data sounds a bit confusing. The idea here, Shrikant, is that the data are never crystal clear. If you make decisions only driven by data, that will drive you backwards, because you need to wait until everything is clear and then you can't do anything about it. So you want data to be a piece of the discussion, but you want to make sure that it's a piece. It's not the only part of the discussion. So, Pontus, well, we have a few more great questions that I want to make sure we've got time for. But again, tell us the ending of the KWM story.
Yeah, I guess the first point is the story is not over, but there's kind of an interim report, you could say, if you like. It was great to see that the Financial Times awarded KWM last year the award in their legal kind of publication side of the most innovative firm in the Asia Pacific. And they also got an award in the digital space, but perhaps more interesting than that, and this is all in the public domain, so I'm not telling anything that's not in the public domain. KWM has done a tremendous amount of work to operationalize this transformation strategy, and you can read many of the things on their website. One thing to highlight is the legal tech belts, where KWM has developed that entire system to kind of help people develop and get recognized for legal technology skills, and they're using a belt system in a similar way that SAP does for quality control. Not SAP, but rather Six Sigma does for quality control. So there are a lot of initiatives. There's a tremendous amount of work, as you can see if you visit their website, in terms of what KWM is doing, and it's very much a journey, and it's ongoing. But as you can see, if you look at all the things that they've done, and you look at some of the things that we allude to in the article, there's been a tremendous amount of work and also really concrete client impact from this transformation effort.
Fantastic. Well, Pontus, we have a ton of great questions that have come in, and we do want to give people a few minutes back. So what I'm going to propose, I've got 3 questions that I think are good questions to answer. I propose that we don't try to both answer them. I will take one of them and give 2 of them to you, and I will bite my tongue and not add anything else to the wonderful answer that you will give. So the first question that I will give to you, Pontus, comes from Angela. How to convince those tough leaders that are stuck to their success on the importance of the change? How do you demonstrate to those leaders a practical way how to change? Again, KWM, risk-averse space. You've got people who have been practicing a certain way for decades successfully. How do you really move the needle and get them convinced?
Yeah, it is like building a case, and maybe lawyers were more open to this than others, but it is building a case using data, using client testimonials, but also understanding how change happens in other industries and what are the dynamics of change. And I would say this, that the biggest challenge is to get leaders to spend the time to listen to the data. If you say that if there are leaders who are willing to dedicate the time, you can construct the story. If the industry is indeed changing, it shouldn't change if not changing. But I think the key challenge is to say, we need to wrestle with this question. And of course, then you need to have expertise to create the right collateral to construct the case, as you might in a legal case. You have to construct the case with multiple data points and multiple pieces of evidence. And then you have to let people digest it, react to it, disagree with it, and then refine as you need. And I would say always that you should not pursue change for the sake of change. You should only pursue it because it's a business imperative and it drives your growth and profitability for the future. But so there's no quick way to do it. It will take leadership time, and it will take a well-constructed, solid case that has the appropriate data to support the need to change.
Fantastic. Then my lightning round response is going to go to the question from Eduardo. Is it common to see poor forecasting projects leading to the creation of pet projects with no justification? What is being done to balance the quality and speed of decisions? Because, you know, one of the challenges is if you wait until there's perfect data that says this project that we've invested in is a dud, then you're squandering a lot of your resources and energy. You know, one of the things we have persistently talked about, Eduardo, is the importance to be really diligent in rooting out what we call the zombie projects, the walking undead, the projects that if you are honest about them will never materially move the needle, but they shuffle and linger on, sucking all the energy out of the organization. So a couple thoughts about what you do to make sure that doesn't happen. First, I would recommend you look at the work that our colleagues Alistair Trotter and Dave Duncan have done about the different portfolio views that you as a leadership team should use to assess the different innovation efforts that you're working on. It's all out there on our website, a very useful set of tools that can help you do this. Number two, the operative question for any idea is, as we turn assumptions into knowledge, are we getting more or less confident that there actually is a good business for us to build? Now, one of those principles of strategic dialogues is battles of assumptions, not beliefs. The idea there is if you're having discussions about ideas and you say, I think or I believe this, and Pontus says, I think or I believe that, it's personal. Someone's got to win, someone's got to lose. You don't tend to have good discussions. But if you say the critical assumption is you've split, you've created something that you can go and address and go and run an experiment around, and then ultimately it's the experiments deciding and no personalities are bruised during the process. So that idea of the portfolio views, that idea of focusing on assumptions are some of the ways that we deal with that issue. And Pontus, one last one for you before we get to our close here. This is in the chat. This is from Lisa Rose. I'm not sure if this is the Lisa Rose who we worked with at P&G many years ago, but if it is, hey Lisa. If not, hey Lisa. It is challenging to convince an organization to change an existing business model to address new entrants when there are major competitors who are not changing, and there's real perceived risk that changes in the acquisition model will provide an opening for those entrants to aggressively steal share. How to balance the old with investments in the new. So how do you think about that? You know, when there isn't, the major competitors aren't doing it, you worry that doing it, you'll take your eye off the ball, those competitors will gain share from you, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question and a tough one. I guess the short answer is I would say always innovate as close to the core as possible. In other words, don't go further from your core business model than you need to respond to disruption or competitive threats or other forces. So that's the first thing. And then as you keep that in mind, you'll find that as you adjust your core business model to respond to disruption and so on, you have to build new capabilities and so on, which may allow you then to deal with these new entrants who might compete with a completely different business model. But the short answer is, and I think, you know, I've also found this to be quite practical, is try to innovate as close to your core as possible. It's all, of course, difficult to determine exactly where that is, but don't push, again, too far if there isn't a compelling reason to do that. And again, that comes back to the point that organizations can only absorb so much change and be judicious about how much you impose on the organization, and only do it when there's a very compelling narrative and reason to do so.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everybody for all of your questions. You know, we're not going to have time to answer all of them, but as I said, we'll try to catch some of them asynchronously in the event report we send out. Also, thank you very much for your engagement. I see that we have maintained about 90% of the group as we reach the tail end of the webinar. We want to, at this point now, offer our final closing reflections. We've got 4, and because we've been tag teaming, Pontus is going to do number 1 and number 3, and I'm going to do number 2 and number 4. So Pontus, take it away.
Yeah, again, the basic one of the basic takeaways is you can't expect to have perfect data. Actually, the fact that there is imperfect data indicates that there is still time to act and opportunity. So don't wait too long.
Then to build on something that we talked about the problem of waiting too long, Let's not make heroes of people who act when they're on burning platforms. Doing what is obvious and necessary is not heroism. The real heroes in organizations are those that take the bold action that end up never ending up on a burning platform.
So again, you have to build and construct the case for change. Private data is not secret data. It exists in the organization. Take the time to gather it. You have to construct the narrative. You have to put it into context for leaders, and you have to give them time to disagree and to voice those disagreements in strategic dialogues. And you have to show them also that there is a cost for inaction.
And then the final point, this gets to one of the questions Jesse asked during the webinar. What does it take for a leader to do this? 2 tips for leaders who want to confront these challenges in a more reliable and robust way. Make a regular habit first of experiencing tomorrow today. As William Gibson once said, the future's already arrived. It's not very evenly distributed. Watch what your kids are doing. Go and see what startups are doing. Take a peek in a university lab, read science fiction, go and get your hands dirty with emerging technology to give you that intuition about what tomorrow would look like. And then, to borrow a phrase from the system psychodynamics world, this is from a letter that the poet John Keats wrote in 1817, build the negative capability to make sense of a very confusing world. Negative capability is being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without reaching for fact and reason. It's getting off of the dance floor and onto the balcony. It's the ability to observe and see what's really going on, remembering that we were given 2 eyes and 1 mouth for a reason. Use them in proportion. The ability to pause. Don't just do something, stand there to make sense of what's going on. And rather than jumping to answers, ask really good questions. You do the things we talked about here. It's not a fail-safe recipe. It is a very tough world out there, but it's the best guidance that we can give you for how you can be a forward-thinking organization that navigates disruptive change and owns the future. Thank you very much again for all the great participation in today's webinar, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Take care and be well.
Thank you all.